All right, guys. Well, we're going to talk about how you can kind of increase your comic book knowledge and kind of get an idea of like maybe why some people kind of get upset with all the retconning, rebooting, and everything that they've done. The all that stuff, and actually just maybe make the experience a bit more enjoyable, richer, if you will. To know things. We're not talking about knowing every comic in the world. We're not talking about knowing every character, not every issue number. That's a key book and the first appearances of people. Just things that go on kind of like behind the scenes. And if you want to know more, this could probably be like a good platform to do that. It's not the end all be all of answers, and it's just what's worked for me. Okay. And then I'm going to end up talking about a guy named Peter Sanderson, one of the most influential people in comic books you've never heard of. Okay, and I don't know a whole lot about the guy. I can only go by his work and what I have here in front of me. Okay, and I actually ended up talking to this guy. Okay, so we'll try to get there. Now, where all this kind of started, I think, is that in the 80s, what you don't hear a lot about is that there, to me, from my point of view, at the time that I was coming out as a 7 years old in 1980, and that next span of 5, 6, 7 years, it seemed like there was this whole new thing going on about, and it rose slowly. Okay, and it kind of actually started with the Teen Titans and Marv Wolfman and Len Wein arriving at DC again, and having this plan that DC continuity is running people off at the time. They had the multiple Earths that Gardner Fox had established. You had Golden Age characters, Silver Age characters. You had new characters popping up. They established Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3. And just multiple, the whole idea of multiple Earths. You had stories of the Super Sons, of Batman and Superman, but you weren't sure where these were taking place. And then they had this one whole other Earth that it's got a number, but at the time it didn't, where if there was any continuity problems, that they said it happened on this Earth. So it was like the dumpster of continuity problems. They just stuck it there. And then you had the Commandy world. And then you go back to the Silver Age and stuff, and probably before that, and you had two Atlantises, and you had one for Superman with Lori Lamaris, and then you had Aquaman's Atlantis, and probably another one popped up, probably in Sea Devils or something, who knows, and all this stuff. But all of a sudden, when comics started, it was more of the editorial stable. Okay, technically, what they did is if you worked for an editor and he had a umbrella of books for you to work on, that was the world you worried about. You were making this editor happy. I mean, it was creative and it was fun, but at the end of the day, you were working for hire. The whole concept of continuity didn't really pop up and take effect until Marvel came along. And this is where I give Stan Lee his credit, okay? To me, that's what Marvel established. One universe outside your window. All these characters are taking place in the same city, the same world. It has got bigger, the same universe and stuff. And Stan Lee was able to guide that ship. He was dialoguing a lot of the things, helping plan a lot of the books, but he was steering the ship. He was the man in the office, making sure that everything sort of chimed. And that wasn't how comic books started out to be, and it changed everything. And all of a sudden, Marvel began outselling DC in the early 70s, and probably what happened sooner if the distribution wasn't under the control. Distribution of comics, believe it or not, was under the control of DC, and that contract came up, and it went on, and all of a sudden, Marvel was able to put out more books. Before that, Marvel had gotten out of had snuck through more characters with their anthology series like Tales to Astonish and Journey into Mystery and stuff like that, where you had like Hulk and Iron Man, Nick Fury and Human Torch. I don't know, but anyway, those old silver books I'm talking about. Okay, a lot of information I'm trying to get out and trying to do it to where you can keep it simple. All right, keep on track here. All right, so anyway, what started happening is that the fans got older. Okay, that's one of the things that they were starting to notice. Silver Age comics really were getting popular with college kids, with the counterculture of Marvel and stuff. And all of a sudden you had people writing letters in, and that's where this guy Pete Sanderson walks in. The letters page actually ended up becoming huge thanks to Peter Sanderson. He was writing into DC Comics, a lot on a lot of their stuff, and they caught the attention of some editors, and they went to Julius Schwartz at the time, and they expanded the letter pages. All of a sudden, the letter pages is like where all the fans, the original fans, can come in there. Pete Sanderson was actually the original comic book reviewer like us, if you want to look at it. And all of a sudden, the letters page got expanded. You know, the JLA and the Flash, and I think he even had like Sanderson's moment or something somewhere along the line. But all of a sudden, it's where you got 2 pages, and the editors started giving serious replies back and stuff. And this guy caught their attention, and they ended up giving him a job, sort of like a researcher at DC. And I think this is around 1980. Okay, and this is where all of a sudden, comic book history was sort of gaining, wanting to know what was going on. So one of the things that actually started coming out is where you already had these fanzines coming out, like Foom, and there's a few that were like independent, fans of the comics, and a lot of those guys ended up working in comics and stuff because of meeting people and interviewing and stuff. And you had tons of books coming out. I mean, you had like Amazing Heroes, okay? You had Comics Interview. And this is a collected edition of their magazine of George Perez, okay? They even, anything that's kind of pop culture, comic book. Doug Wildley, they did an interview, and you got like this great Johnny Quest thing. Just stuff like that was out there. And then you also had things like Comics Interview, and they were talking about comics that were coming out, interviewing people, and you read these things. It's like it wasn't work. They talked about comics that were coming out, interview some creators. They would kind of look at what's going on with the companies and stories, and they expanded them. And you had things like Comic Scene coming out, and all of a sudden you're getting like these great, that's a Mobius, that is a Mobius Punisher by Marvel, which to me was really cool to see, really different, his interpretation and stuff. And they were letting you know about these older guys, and they'd go back into, they'd interview people like Doug Wildley and the history of Mobius, and talk a little bit about his work. There was no internet back then. You didn't hear anything about this stuff, and all of a sudden this stuff was coming out. You'd meet older comic book collectors and hear these stories, but nothing could be cited. Everybody had a little spin on it. It was a grapevine, okay? So all those came out, and you kind of absorbed that stuff, or at least for me. And this stuff went on, stuff like that. The movies would come out. All of a sudden you get this exclusive art by Jim Lee doing some X-Men, a big 2-page spread in here. You get Comic Spectacular, and all of a sudden you started like seeing, Judge Dredd. You'd get these great posters inside that you could take out 2-sided if you wanted to, books that were coming out. So there's like a lot of things to do that with. And of course, how can I go on without saying in the 90s we had Wizard magazine come out. Good grief, I had a bunch of those. Yeah, here they go. And then Comic Scene came out. The history, we were watching history in the 80s and 90s, man. You didn't know it. You had Crisis on Infinite Earth, Secret Wars, things they were doing that you never heard before. Frank Miller on Dark Knight, Alan Moore, blah, 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 blah. And then in the early 90s, it starts out with a big boom because all of a sudden you get, Image Comics, and this Wizard magazine came out. And all of a sudden they were hiring big-time creators to sit here and do the covers for them, and they were mixing characters. One of the first ones they did was like around Wizard 9 or something like that. They had Cable and I think Shaft. I think that's the one. Shaft from Youngblood and Cable from Marvel, with a Rob Liefeld cover. And Marvel was like, no, don't do that. And all of a sudden, this book started taking off. And they started getting into like comics and cards and all this stuff. And they started interviewing Alan Moore, and they started talking about people that influenced them. And all of a sudden, man, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. You're starting to see behind the scenes. And what happened with me is, and I'm just going to give you this as an example because started seeing a big picture. You'd read editorials in the comics, you'd read this kind of stuff, and you start hearing about people talking behind the scenes, and all of a sudden, man, there's like this comic book history that nobody knows about that's going on behind the scenes. Everybody starts talking about Kirby and all this stuff, and it really popped around 85, I think, and my interpretation was all of a sudden everybody's talking about comic book history, and that's what we're going to talk about. And I started seeing that you can take other interviews and you start seeing different perspectives of them, and you get an even bigger picture, and people start like naming names that the other person didn't. And Amazing Heroes, they're interviewing Marv Wolfman about Crisis, and they talk about this big meeting they had with all the editors about what was expected of them and how they came about and what was going to happen in Crisis and how to make all these books kind of flow a little bit better. And he said it went great. All the editors were right on board, and it was great. But then you read George Perez's interview in this, and they mention the same meeting, and he's just sort of like, well, I wasn't sure what they wanted. You start hearing a different perspective. And then also, he starts giving this history of the characters and stuff. Now, this is what enriches the book for me. Not only are we getting history behind the scenes, but you're getting the history of these characters, where they came from. Like the fact that the Monitor, do I have a picture of him? See if I have a good picture of the Monitor. The Monitor from Crisis on Infinite Earth, his main, well, there he is dead. But the Monitor from Crisis on Infinite Earth, started out as the librarian 15 years before he came out in a Marv Wolfman story. For all I knew, that could be Marvel or something. I can't remember. And that's where the motivation came. And when Perez came on board to do the character designs, he ended up getting, he thinks it was influenced by the High Evolutionary at Marvel, and then it ended up being a character from, it was a bad guy in two Ray Harryhausen movies. I think one of the Sinbad movies and something else. So, you know, and all of a sudden they got to Pariah. And if you remember Pariah, you know, this guy screaming here, you know, his look was based on Peter O'Toole, the actor. So here I am reading Pariah, and now I have a voice, Peter O'Toole. You know, and it's kind of cool. It enriches the characters and stuff. All right. So this is the kind of, you start putting that stuff together, and that's one way to do it, right? So then we get to Pete Sanderson. We mentioned Crisis. We mentioned how it seemed like comic book history was kind of like really getting out there. And for the younger guys and the older guys and all these little stories you heard and the editorials and fanzines were coming out, you just kind of absorb that stuff. You can get these things cheap. And what's even better today is you can actually pick and choose if you decide to start digging on what books you want, you know, because, you know, we all know what's in them now. You didn't know back then. All right, so the other thing in the history of comics, how you learn this stuff. Number one, you read the comics, okay? You know, it shouldn't be work. You should know your stuff, you know, and enjoy it. You know, and find something, you know, if you find that niche, man, you're just going to absorb this stuff naturally anyway. Number two is be kind of willing to do a little research and stuff if you're interested in it. All this stuff led me to other stuff, and made me a George Perez fan, maybe a John Byrne fan. I made me fans of certain characters. It brought me around to Kirby. You can kind of follow the careers of those guys, you know, and you start reading editorials and interviews with them, and, you know, Commandy number 32 back in the 70s had a big interview with Kirby inside of it with, you know, black and white pictures and stuff. And you just sort of observe this stuff and you hear people talking about it. You have Jack Kirby Collectors, which I didn't get down, and it goes back to what was going around that time, how people remember things about Jack, and interviews with his wife and old interviews about Kirby and all this stuff. You know, and you start getting a big picture of what was going on at Marvel and stuff if you're interested. So in 1980, going back to where we were at, if you hung in there with me, a guy named Pete Sanderson got a job. They got hired because of all the letters he was writing to, you know, DC and stuff. And what they were doing is Marv Wolfman and Len Wein, you know, Marv Wolfman had the idea, let's make one universe. Let's clean up all this continuity. Let's make it more focused. Len Wein, Bob Greenberger was an editor. They were all on board. So they hired Pete Sanderson, and here's his job: to read every comic book by DC Comics from 1938 to 1980 and take notes. First appearances, characters, powers, and all this stuff. And this was his job. And this was all to hand to Marv Wolfman for this big job they're going to do on this Crisis book they were talking about. So for 5 years they were actually building up to Crisis. 1980 to 85. Research, plotting threads, get with the editors, kind of give an idea what's going on, and nobody heard anything about it that I'm aware of. And if they say they did, I haven't run across anything that's been published or anything of this is coming, you know. So you got to think what went on. This is like, you know, in that time we had Empire Strikes Back comes out, we had Return of the Jedi come out, and it was still 2 years later. So I mean, a lot was going on in that time. Okay. So what they did is, instead of wasting that research, they ended up putting it in there, and they came up with the who's who at DC. Okay. And these are just real simple things. You can look right in there, and there's Len Wein's name, there's Marv Wolfman's name, there's Pete Sanderson's name, okay, as a researcher and stuff. And these were just real quick, alphabetical order of all this research that he had done with little notes. They're not real big, you know. It's a brief history, brief powers, and great pictures and stuff, you know, little profiles, right? So what happened was, as they turned around, and he got hired by Marvel. I don't know what that transition was, but he got hired at Marvel, and he became their archivist. He's the only one they've ever had. And he started doing the same thing for them. And this is where I speculate, this is my opinion, I speculate this is when Marvel caught wind that DC was having a big crossover event, and they've got all this research by Sanderson, and they're going to put it to use, right? And that's where two things came out of that, to beat Marvel. Marvel's the idea, and then you have, DC came up with the idea, but Marvel probably has the better execution of a lot of these things, right? All of a sudden we have Marvel Universe come out, these little thin, you know, character profiles, a bit more in depth. Mark Grunwald got on board, and right there, man, There he is, one of the writers, Pete Sanderson. You know, Mark Grunwald was head writer and designer. Jim Shooter was the chief, and there's Pete Sanderson all of a sudden, and they hurry up and they get this out. Now, the reason I think this was rushed and they wanted to do better is because years later, a few years later, they came out with the deluxe editions of these. Okay, a bit thicker, a bit more effort put into them, expanded histories and stuff. To me, that was the blueprint to beat DC to who's who. And what was their answer to this big crisis that was coming out that they didn't know about? Secret Wars. They hurried up and got this out. Even had two different pencilers on it, you know, due to Mike Zeck and stuff. And Jim Shooter himself took control. Now, what happened behind the scenes to lead up to this, I have no idea. You know what I'm saying? But all I know is that DC started their plan in '80. Pete Sanderson is the thing that connects them, and it's after Sanderson gets to Marvel that all this stuff starts coming out, and then DC followed suit with something they already had in plan. I think it was just Marvel getting it out before, okay? And, you know, and ethically, does that sound bad? Maybe, but the spirit of competition, we got some really good stuff, right? And that led up to reading this stuff and not wanting to waste all this research. Sanderson did it, and we ended up getting some even better stuff, right? One of the tricks that I think actually helped all this stuff to get put out there in the Who's Who in the Marvel Universe books, handbooks and stuff, is that I don't know how publishing rights work, but there's an infamous thing where Marvel found out that the name Captain Marvel, the original, you know, Shazam, Captain Marvel, were up, and they hurried up and made Captain Marvel, the Kree soldier, and they kept him in print even after they killed him. He still pops up. Every so years, in order to keep publishing rights and a name and stuff, you have to print them. So what better way to get all these quirky little characters in one, you know, under one umbrella and get it out there and have them published and, you know, be able to have some breathing room, is to put these out. They're all published and stuff, alphabetical order. That's also why you see weird characters popping up that just won't die and stuff, you know, in books, or a weird miniseries coming up. But the publication rights are probably getting close to coming out. Let's throw them out there. But this led into more things, you know, due to crisis happening, and they had people like Roy Thomas and stuff like that. They ended up, you know, let's put this back out there, let's let everybody know where we're coming, and they tweaked some of the origins and stuff, but they ended up coming with like series like Secret Origins, you know, to go along with these Who's Who, which I thought was just fantastic, right? And then you come to find out that this led to me finding the Secret Origins from the 70s. They already reprinted some of these stories where these characters came from, so you're able to get your history there. And then Pete Sanderson kept moving on, right? He kept working, and they archived them. And then you get the Silver Age history. You get like a big picture of Marvel, thanks to Marvel Saga. This isn't just telling the beginning of the Marvel Universe in comics chronological, you know, just chronology for us, like when the books came out. But now they had probably like 25 years, I think 25 years of stories and stuff, and they're able to go back, and they took like things from Alpha Flight and X-Men and other books that happened while the Fantastic Four was going on, you know, in '61, and he's able to put them in chronological order according to that universe and stuff. And Pete Sanderson was the head writer on this and stuff, man. And it starts all the way back with, you know, the birth of Galactus. He came from a previous universe, you know, that before the Big Bang for us, there was another universe here, and Galactus is that survivor, and the Watchers were here watching it. And way back in the day, you had the Kree and the Skrull coming up. All this stuff had been established in the comic books. And they start back, you know, they start with the K-Man days, and they talk about what Kirby brought in with the Deviants and the Eternals, and they go back to the Inhumans. And it's all, you know, and he puts it all together, World War II, the stuff that actually happened, the Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos, and they're able to tie it in with the Invaders. And, you know, we got 25 issues of, you know, Marvel history. And that also helped. When I was in 7th grade, the one time I got in big trouble, the one time I actually got in trouble in middle school, the math teacher just told everybody not to talk, and I'll be damned, for some reason I just had to know something. I turned around and asked somebody. She gave me a 10-page paper to write on any subject I wanted, and I did it on Marvel Saga. I did it on the history of the Marvel Universe according to Marvel Saga. So, and there's cool things that came out of this. Now, everything I've talked about, you know, I've covered, you know, a little bit of history, how this stuff came about, how I read it, how to absorb it, and stuff like that. But there were some fun things that happened in these, right? Everything I've kind of talked about was probably some corporate guys saying we're going to utilize this. You know, we have all this research, we're not going to waste it. Let's make some money. We can save our publishing rights. That's how I'm picturing it. But then you had the people who actually worked on it. Mark Grunwald was like the heart of Marvel. This guy was like Mr. Continuity, Mr. Knew all the books. Just, you know, you go back and look at his Quasar work, and you see all these B characters he threw in there, and you saw what he did with Squadron Supreme, where he made his mark, and he had a huge run on Captain Marvel and stuff, right? But there's some fun stuff that came out of this, right? So, you know, they're sitting there, they need profiles, they need somebody to draw these characters and stuff, you know, to kind of go with what they're putting in here. And they did some fun stuff, right? There's a character named Gladiator at Marvel who is basically an alien with Superman's powers. So we all know that it's a version of Superman, right? Well, they came and got the Superman artist, Kurt Swan, to draw it, right? That's fun, right? That's them a little tongue-in-cheek for the comic book fan who gets what they, you know, I see what you did there, right? And then the one that I get a kick out of is, you know, they even put in like, I think one of the I think the Barry Allen Flash's first villain was a guy named Turtle Man. And, you know, these came out in the 80s and stuff. So what did they do? What did they do to get Turtle Man out there? Here's Turtle Man, right? Instead of getting like, you know, some house artist or, you know, Silver Age artist needed work, they got Peter Laird. For you guys that don't know, he's co-creator and I think artist on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So as you went through this, you know, there's another thing. You get the in-jokes if you know your comics and your history and all this stuff. I just thought that was cool. You know, this guy's working on Teenage Mutant Turtles. Who we want to get to draw Turtle Man, you know. So there's like a lot of stuff on there. A lot of great covers, a lot of fun. And this wasn't work. This was just me buying these every month and absorbing them and rereading them. And I think a few of these actually have some marks and underlines and stuff that I saw that I thought was real cool because I wanted to go back and read the book and, you know, that it came from. So there you go. That's just one way. So there you go. You got, you know, how to increase your comic book knowledge, which what you know, so what worked for me, and you got a little history on, you know, one of the most influential guys in comics that you never heard of, Pete Sanderson. All right, there you go. Later, guys. Thanks for hanging in there with the old school.